Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science Dispatch Podcast. My name is Cameron English, your host as always. My sidekick, sadly, is probably on a beach somewhere sipping a Mai Tai. Chuck is enjoying the start of his golden years. He's on vacation. So we've got a little bit of a different show, and it's a pretty cool show. Dr. Barbara Billauer is back with us, our resident legal scholar. Hi, Barbara. Very nice to see you.
Hi, Cameron. Good to see you again.
But we also have a special guest. We have two lawyers, which is a little bit intimidating, if I'm being honest. But we've got Professor Michelle Mello with us. And Michelle, you are a professor of law and public health policy at Stanford. And if I counted right, you have authored over 250 articles related to
right.
Public health policy and law and its intersection with medicine and so forth. And you wrote a lot about COVID-19 as well, which is always an interesting topic. So welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so our colleague Chuck, Dr. Dinnerstein, wrote an article based on a piece that you wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine called "When AI Fails, Who's Accountable? A Healthcare Primer." So this is all about, and he's sort of summarizing your article here, but it's all about AI in medicine and in healthcare, and in particular, who's at fault when something goes wrong. So there's so many fascinating edges to this. But maybe before we dive into the specifics, you could give us a primer. So what is AI? Is there like a set definition of it? And then how is it being used in healthcare right now?
There are many definitions of it. I think for purposes, we could just focus on a simple definition that talks about models that are learning models that are generating output based on analysis of huge quantities of data that are being ingested and mined for associations. And my focus is on healthcare AI, and in that context, these models are used for all kinds of purposes, from kind of back office healthcare operations to making recommendations for treatment and diagnosis.
So it seems like it's being maybe not widely used, but increasingly it's becoming more common in medicine. It seems like there's a lot of benefits to it, but as we just alluded to, your article sort of focuses on, what can go wrong, or at least who's at fault when things do go wrong. So can you kind of give us an introduction to that aspect of the conversation?
Yeah, I think physicians are anxious creatures by nature, and maybe for good reason, because medical malpractice litigation has bedeviled them for their entire careers for many of them. It's an area that feels scary to them because it seems hard to predict who is going to sue them over what and what the outcome will be. And whenever a new technological tool comes online, this anxiety is not surprisingly transferred to that new technology, and it can produce behaviors that are undesirable, including reluctance to use the technology and being overly conservative in other aspects of their practice in order to generate protective documentation or measures to prevent lawsuits from bedeviling them. And so the concern around AI is that these behaviors might arise when physicians are confronted with opportunities to use it, and that might be good. In some cases, they should be cautious about adopting some of these technologies. But in other cases, these technologies promise real benefits for patients. And so we would at least like decisions to use or not use them to be based on analysis of the best interests of the patient and on quality of care. It feels especially scary to physicians, I think, because the courts have given so little signal about how they will handle these kinds of claims. There are not very many of these claims that have been publicly reported out. And this area of law generally is one that has evinced deep ambivalence about how to treat software-related claims against developers. Should we treat them like other kinds of product liability claims and hold manufacturers accountable? Or is it something different? And if it is, and it's not going to be developers who are accountable, well, who is?
So this is a question for both of you. I'm very curious. We've talked a lot about on this show, Michelle, about how the courts often misinterpret important scientific concepts when they're brought before them, especially in product liability situations. So I'm wondering, and Barbara has talked a lot about that with a lot of things, like with pesticide litigation, for example. That's a really common problem. How significant is that in influencing the kind of cases, or I guess the kind of decisions that are being made, the sort of regulations that are coming out of those? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so with Neil Guha, who's a young computer scientist and legal scholar here at Stanford, we looked at about 50 reported cases involving either software liability or AI-specific liability, some related to healthcare and some not related to healthcare. And we noticed a couple of things that are germane to your question. One is that judges, when they're writing judicial opinions, don't seem to have the ability to distinguish between AI, ML models, and other kinds of software. And that's problematic because there are concerns that arise for AI, ML that don't arise for other kinds of software. And there's a worry, at least for us, that courts might be tempted to set down general rules that would apply to both kinds of software when they shouldn't. For example, there's a lot more opacity around how AI models produce the output that they do. And historically, when courts have been confronted with seemingly deserving plaintiffs that are having trouble proving their case, they will often generate helpful rules that will lessen the burden of proof for plaintiffs. And that would make a lot of sense in some aspects of AI-related claims, and it wouldn't make a lot of sense for other kinds of software claims. So the first problem is that judges may not be able to understand this technology well enough to formulate thoughtfully crafted rules. The second complexity that we saw is disagreement or lack of certainty around who's an appropriate expert in these cases and for which purposes. So to prove their claim, plaintiffs will bring expert witnesses. In medical malpractice cases, historically, this has been other physicians who will testify about what they would have done in a similar situation or what other doctors do in that situation. But when the engine making the treatment recommendation is not human, it's computer, it's just not clear who an appropriate expert is or even what the standard of care necessarily would be. And so again, it creates uncertainty. It's not unresolvable. It will certainly be resolved with time. But if you're a physician practicing in this time, it feels a little bit scary.
Michelle, let me ask this. My experience, having practiced med-mal law for a long time, is that the med-mal lawyers on both sides are superb. They're just really, really phenomenal. They know a ton of medicine, and the good ones know more medicine than their experts. But now that we're bringing in AI in, and I know that you, who are probably the foremost med-mal researcher in the country, well, in the world today, also brought in AI. To what extent do you think that med-mal lawyers are going to have to work in concert with AI lawyers, or do you think they'll be able to learn the complexities of AI that will be needed for cross-examination?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And you're probably a better place to answer it than I am because you understand something about how well these attorneys can learn. Obviously, this isn't the first time that they've been called upon to understand and explain and craft arguments around a really complicated medical technology. For example, there are lots of devices that fail or seem to fail or have bad outcomes, and they have to understand and make a case about whose fault it was and prove that. But again, this is kind of like the next level of complexity because for this product, even the people who make it can't really explain oftentimes why the models produce the results that they do. So I guess the other complexity, as you know, is that medical malpractice lawyers are not always great product liability lawyers, and these cases probably are going to involve both kinds of claims against the doctor in the hospital and also claims against the developer. And so, yes, I could envision that you might need to bring in somebody with special expertise to handle that side of the claim.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem that we're seeing with some of the products cases that Cameron had mentioned, that the lawyers are having a harder time getting their hands on statistics, which is going to be involved in these AI cases as well, I presume.
A related question. I think Chuck mentioned this in his article, but at least in some cases, it seems the underlying code for these applications or programs, whatever you want to call them, they're proprietary. And so I'm wondering how that affects a case of this sort. Like if you're trying to prove that you were injured as a result of this and you don't have access to, the various technical aspects of the program, how do you prove your case, or can you?
Well, the ordinary rules of legal discovery will apply, and things that are probative and relevant to proving your claim should ordinarily be made available to you for purposes of the litigation. But I think it's not just a legal problem, it is a technical problem here of understanding how the model works. I think that the kinds of information that a plaintiff can get that will be very helpful is testing data about what testing was done, on what data, and what did it show? And again, that's going to be very, very helpful in establishing what the known weaknesses and strengths of the tool were. I think what's going to be much harder is to look within the code, even if you have the code, to understand how that code produced the result it did in a particular case, because these are not simple predictive regression models that have 15 variables in them, and you can see the beta coefficients, the weights attached to each of those variables in generating the outcome of the model. There are potentially thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different parameters that could be in these models. Those weights are not produced or not known. And it's going to be, again, for this particular guy who got injured, hard to understand, even with all this information, why the model made the recommendation it did.
To the extent that you had mentioned before that this AI concept integrates large bodies of data, and to the extent that we know that, at least in clinical tests, a lot of the testing is done on the white population, and there's a discrepancy or a disparity in smaller groups or minority groups, what we call minority groups. To what extent do you think there will be a standard of care for a physician to investigate the data or the testing set, the population used to generate the recommendations? If a physician has a predominantly black practice, African American, whatever, and the data is driven from a predominantly white or age-related, if the physician has an older population. So to what extent will that change the standard of care?
Yeah. I don't think it'll change the standard of care, meaning what the physician should have done in a given situation. But I think the interesting question that you're raising is, does a physician have a responsibility to vet the tool in general and when she's using it on a particular patient? And I think the answer generally there is no, that there hopefully is a health system involved in procuring this tool, and before that procurement decision is made, very carefully vetting this tool. So I work here at Stanford, we have a hospital. The hospital is the one that's going to make the decision about what tools get to be used on patients here. And so the physician's responsibility is going to be, I expect, limited to reading the material that the hospital provides about this tool. So as with any other clinical practice guideline or other, doctors use other kinds of algorithms all the time. They're just not artificial intelligence driven algorithms. As with any of those, you have to understand what it includes and what it doesn't include and how well validated it is. That's all true. I don't think they're going to be responsible for actually doing that validation. But I think the hospital could potentially be on the hook, though, if they decide to use a tool that is, vetted on training data they know to be predominantly white or a small number of people, or a fancy academic medical center, and they're a community hospital, and they don't take steps to train their workforce in how to kind of adjust their thinking. Because let's not forget that ultimately, at the end of the day, right now, the physician is still the decision maker. This is just a recommendation that the physician is taking into account. And as long as that's the case, then the hospital standard of care is going to be around interrogating these training data issues and then communicating with their providers about what they've learned to train them.
But you've just identified another bucket for the plaintiff's lawyers to go after in terms of identifying or targeting the hospital for not vetting the data set for its applicability to the patient base. And
absolutely.
Yeah, so that's really interesting that there will be a responsibility on someone or some entity, but it will fall perhaps to the hospital or the medical center or the medical association involved. That's very interesting.
Right. And so what concerns me the most is the physician who is in a solo or small practice, not connected with a larger health system, who doesn't have the benefit of those expertise. And that physician is going to be relying essentially on the marketing materials of the external company that made this tool, this AI tool. And, there's a lot of exuberance in the AI development industry around their tools. And so one just worries that the information provided will not be enough to allow a physician in a particular practice setting to evaluate how well that tool is going to work for her patients.
To the extent that AI is not used as a recommender, but is used as some kind of baseline or standard, let's say in x-rays or pattern recognition, where the AI tools are scoring extremely highly. To what extent there will the physician, do you think, be able to pass off liability and say, well, the tool identified this as a duct or a carcinoma in situ, and it turned out it was something else?
So I think that we are a long way from a place where a physician is going to be evaluated, is going to be given like a pass because there was a tool that told them to do something. Instead, they're going to have to continue to meet the standard of reasonableness, which is going to come down to, was it a reasonable decision for them to have followed the model output in the circumstances? And so the jury would be asked to look at things like what the physician knew or should have known about the testing performance of that model and on which kinds of patients. And, was the physician's own independent judgment contrary to the model output? And if so, what made them decide to overrule it? I think it's very interesting to think about, in the radiology example that you raised, should a physician's read of the scan be first or second in the sequence of things that lead to an ultimate interpretation? Because if the AI's read is first, that sets a decision frame that can affect how the human brain makes a judgment. Whereas if it's second, it's maybe confirming the physician's own judgment. That looks different legally as well. So I think the upshot is that you're not going to be off the hook as a physician, but it will often be possible to argue that you relied on this recommendation reasonably. And actually, that if you had done anything else, that would have been very unreasonable given the performance of this tool and its wide use in radiology.
To what extent does automation bias come into play here? Because it seems like that's pretty closely related to a lot of the topics you both just jumped between. Just go ahead. I think you know what I'm asking.
Yeah, so automation bias is a well-documented tendency of humans to over-rely on computer decision support, especially after they become familiar with it. They become a little bit too trusting, and they don't spot and intervene on errors when they should. And, this is a problem for the human brain generally. It's a problem across all kinds of fields and in professional settings and non-professional settings. We know it happens. And the question is, how do you sort of keep people vigilant in the face of automation bias? I worry about it, especially for physicians, because they're so busy. The whole point of having AI tools for them in a lot of cases is to try to reduce this epidemic problem of burnout, which comes from just their extreme workloads. And so we get this sort of paradox where in order for the tool to work as intended, physicians by definition would be spending less time on the task. And the way to achieve that benefit most directly is automation bias. It's just a trust. So how do you counteract this? I think we're still trying to figure that out for physicians. Obviously, you want to train people on it. There is still certainly a strong professional culture around avoiding mistakes, being careful, not signing your name to things unless you're really ready to take responsibility for them. And so on and so forth. So there's some kind of natural bulwarks, but I think it is also true that people's vigilance will be higher when these tools are new. Over time, that vigilance will relax in many cases. And if the tool improves over time because it gets more data and more practice, maybe that's okay. But I think at the end of the day, this is just going to be part of the physician's own responsibility is to maintain this level of vigilance even when they're getting this assist.
Is this technology, these AI-powered assistance tools, are they ready for prime time? Because we've had a lot of conversations about other tools in medicine. They seem to be jumping way out ahead of the law, or like regulators don't even know how to deal with this yet. So what do you think? Is this going at an appropriate pace, or do we need to hit the brakes as a society? What do you make of that?
Well, it's a hard question to answer because there are so many different tools doing so many different things. I think what I could say generally is that you're right. There are not really many regulatory safeguards in place, although that also is changing very quickly with the commitment of the Biden administration to do that. And with healthcare organizations' realization that they have a stake, financially and otherwise, in regulating what tools are being used in their walls and how. It is moving very quickly, very, very quickly, and it's moving in often very non-systematic ways. You know, at Stanford, I think the hospitals are very careful to have a vetting process, a governance process, so that you can't roll these things out on patients without going through review. Lots of other places don't do it that way. And again, they're really relying on marketing materials and representations from developers about what the tool can achieve. So, you know, I think we're very much still trying to figure this out within healthcare organizations about how do you govern this, what processes should be used, how slow should you go. But I think here at Stanford, the feeling is very much that even if it seems to be a tool that has been widely adopted elsewhere or that a developer has a lot of optimism about or a very impressive sales presentation, we still want to do very careful vetting. We want to start small. We start with pilots in clinical areas that we think are relatively low risk. We collect lots of information and analyze it carefully before we, as you say, make it ready for prime time, meaning rolling it out enterprise-wide.
Okay.
I have one final question
go ahead.
for me then. So as I said, you've probably done more research on medical malpractice issues than anyone, across the gamut. Do you notice that this AI presents issues that you haven't confronted before or haven't seen before? Is this in some way different, or is this just
I think legally the novel issue is whether software is going to be deemed a product, and if so, like in what contexts? Because as you probably know, Barbara, as a law professor yourself, there's like a pretty thin history in the area of tort law for software liability. There's just not much in the written record at all. The case law that we do have mostly arises out of injuries that are not physical. They're like economic injuries, like you use investment management software and it makes a mistake and you lose money. And courts have been reluctant in those cases to say, yeah, this looks like a product. And when it's a product, we have this particular standard of care to hold manufacturers accountable for those harms. But we just don't know how they're going to ultimately classify and analyze product liability claims that relate to physical injuries to humans and arise not just from software, but from this special kind of software. And, I have trouble like teaching this topic because I don't even know what to tell the students about where it's going, except that my overall observation about the history of personal injury law is that courts find a way when there is a deserving class of plaintiffs that seem to be shut out of recovering money because of the rules that we have, which maybe didn't anticipate their specific situation. They tend to accommodate those plaintiffs over time. So my expectation is that over time we will see more ability of plaintiffs to recover in these cases, which means more liability for product developers as well as for hospitals and physicians.
What I've seen is that's balanced against the societal need for fostering a product so that blood products, for example, and blood banks are protected from liability, protected from negligence claims. You'd bring a case, protected from product liability claims, you'd bring a claim for negligence, but you couldn't sue for a blood bank problem under product liability law. And so there are carve-outs where even in vaccine litigation, those are different carve-outs, but where the government wants to protect vaccine development, so we have preemption. So, and you talk about preemption in your article. So there are carve-outs if some groups, judges, legislatures want to protect a novel industry.
Yeah, there have been carve-outs. They're usually in situations where there has already been just like an avalanche of litigation against the product manufacturer and they're threatening to exit the market for an important medical product. Whereas here this is a very, very early stage and there certainly isn't a tsunami of litigation. However, we have already seen Congress provide social media platforms with liability protection under Section 230 for things that other people post. We have already seen physician groups lobbying Congress for immunity for them when they use software, AI tools. So certainly the efforts are there. Will they be successful? I think probably not. But again, it's really early days, and that's what makes this kind of a scary time for everybody at the same time that people recognize just enormous upside to adoption of some of these tools.
Crazy, crazy stuff. It seems like there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of good that could come out of this, as you said, but it's just so new. We really can't say one way or the other, I suppose is the way to look at it. If one of our listeners wants to follow you and learn more about your work, where should they go? Are you on Twitter or any social media?
I am on X at Michelle, capital M _ Mello. And I have a website at Stanford Law School where folks can see other things that I produced in this area.
Awesome. Well, we'll put links to those. And then if people want to look up the New England Journal of Medicine article, it's called Understanding Liability Risk from Using Healthcare Artificial Intelligence Tools. Really interesting reading. Something that I think most people, we all consume healthcare, so you should probably have at least a basic grasp of how this works. So thank you again for joining us, Michelle. Thank you, Barbara, as always. It's always a pleasure to see you. You can follow us on social media as well. The organization is at ACSH.org. I'm at CamJ English. Barbara, as far as I know, is the smart one of the group. She's not participating in the food fight that we call X these days. So good for you. If you email the organization, you can do it through our website, and that will get it to Barbara. So thank you for joining us. And with that, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.